great to see your face. I've obviously seen you on social media. We've interacted a bit. It's always nice to meet people that you just quote know online. Um, let's start with a little history of yourself, kind of a quick biography. Tell us a bit about how you were raised, and you're an ELCA pastor now. Is that in continuity with how you were raised, or is that distinct from it?
Kind of a little bit of a both and, which is a very Lutheran answer of me. But yeah, my parents were married in the Catholic Church. My dad's family is Catholic, but my mom's dad was a Lutheran pastor, and he had an interesting experience in the church. We have this tradition on my mom's side where it sort of skips a generation. So his grandfather was also a pastor. Then my grandpa became a pastor, notably after he did not succeed in his tryout for professional baseball. That was really his first dream, was in athletics. Wow. But he is a wonderful pastor. He served during the time of civil rights, the Vietnam War, in both Nebraska and Missouri and Kansas. And then my grandparents went through a divorce. And at that time, that was not a time when getting divorced was okay in the church. So he ended up kind of staying in the ministry tangentially for the rest of his life. But as I knew him, he had a lot of anger and a sense of betrayal towards the church, which he had given so much of his life to. So when I got ordained, he didn't come, but he would often, write me letters with Bible passages. So I had this, that experience on that side. And then my father's family, my dad's one of 7, and sort of went to Catholic school in elementary school, but was, also not real enthused about the church, remembered falling asleep during Mass, not understanding the Mass when it was in Latin. So that was my foundation. And then my parents started going to, mid 80s, good old church growth movement time. They started going to a Lutheran church that was meeting in the elementary school near our house. And so even though they were married in the Catholic Church, that's where they ended up worshiping. They really liked this new pastor who ended up baptizing me. That pastor stayed at that church for over 30 years, and it became a huge suburban congregation. Lutheran in name, pretty Lutheran in style. It was in Minnesota. So there is that cultural Lutheranism that we have up here among white Minnesotans. Yes. But I was confirmed with 200 kids. Our confirmation classes had a band. We had pizza. So it was very sort of evangelical light. And then I went to Baptist Bible camp. So every year I was told, I needed to give my heart to Jesus. And I was always like, well, I was baptized as a baby. And really was shaped by evangelicalism, as a college student, as a sports writer working in Florida. So I think my life has been very shaped by the trends that shaped Christianity throughout it. I remember the debate in my public school about are they going to teach abstinence-based or abstinence-only sex education?
Yeah.
So, I could say more about that, but really shaped by Lutheranism, Catholicism, but also shaped very much by evangelicalism and by the church growth movement that really shaped the white Midwest.
Yeah. Yeah. I grew up in Minnesota as well, Angela. And
congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. No, but that cultural, oops, sorry. I accidentally hit a button there. That was
the crickets.
Completely unintentional. That is crazy.
Were you throwing shade on your remarks?
I know. I was actually unintentionally throwing shade on myself there. I just moved my coffee cup and it hit it. Anyway, I was going to say, I heard Garrison Keillor say a while ago, one of his jokes that I think rings very true about Minnesota is just that everyone in Minnesota is a Lutheran. Even the atheists are Lutheran because the Lutheran God is the only one they know to reject. So anyway.
That's funny.
Yeah, but let's get into your book a little bit.
Yeah.
The sort of the back cover introduction to your book says white boys and men are dangerous, and white boys and men are struggling. I remember I put on social media like years ago. I think it was after some shooting that had happened that was, again, perpetrated by a white man. I sort of half tongue in cheek said what's wrong with the white men? Like, I think we need a moratorium on like ordaining, white men. I think it was a scandal that it was a pastor that had
Sure.
abused someone or something like that. And I said, like, half jokingly, like, let's just do a moratorium on ordaining white men until we figure out what's going on. Um, and I got a lot of pushback about that. People are like, well, hey, not all white men, which I imagine you have gotten some of that kind of pushback as well. But, statistically speaking, white men, like, we're not doing okay. We're having a really hard time. And that makes us both dangerous and struggling, as your book says. And so, and how people are dealing with this across the country. How did the idea for this book take shape for you?
Yeah, another word that came to my mind when we were talking about that is vulnerable, this sense of vulnerability.
Yes.
And I sure feel that, part of this book comes from my experiences as a mom of two white boys, one of whom is about to be a teenager. So that is very much part of the genesis of this book. But it wasn't the book I planned to write. I was kind of working on a different book after my first book, Red State Christians, came out in 2019. We did a new sort of updated version in 2022. And let me tell you, like, when I set out and originally thought I want to write books someday, I did not think that both my books were going to be, mirroring up to the first and second Donald Trump presidential administrations. But here we are. So that is something that happened. And, you cannot follow what's happening in American politics today and not see the role of this violent masculinity that's being championed by the Christian right and its power within this administration. But I was working on a different book. The publisher came to me about this idea initially of a smaller book specifically for churches looking at white boys raising boys. And I was maybe a little bit interested in it, but a couple of things happened that made it become more of a passion project to me and turned into the book that we're talking about today. One of which was just talking to other parents and specifically talking to parents of maybe teenage 20-something boys, grandparents, also teachers, coaches, everyone who really loves boys and young men in this age, and just hearing all these stories of struggle, of confusion, of surprise, and this feeling of disconnectedness. So I felt like, wow, this is something that people are really hungry for and they're not getting. We have this huge wealth of content around, how to be a quote unquote masculine man, how to dominate your wife in the way of the supposedly that the Bible tells you to. We have all that content being thrown at us through the algorithms and social media, and we don't have much to counter it. So that was the first thing, is just hearing anecdotally from people in my community that really care and are searching for something to give them some way to get their arms around what's going on. And then the second thing was doing a podcast with a man named Caleb Campbell. You guys might know him as well. He wrote the book Disarming Leviathan. We were talking about Christian nationalism, and just kind of as a part of that conversation, maybe even after, I think I was doing a podcast with him after it was done, we started talking and he telling me more of his story about growing up in evangelicalism, then spending some time as part of a neo-Nazi skinhead group. And then moving from the neo-Nazi group and the skinhead group to becoming an acolyte, a disciple of Pastor Mark Driscoll of Mars Hill, and really getting into that idea of a white Jesus who really bases his character on violence, on control. And then Caleb becoming a pastor, living through COVID, and ultimately becoming now this champion against that kind of Jesus, that kind of Christianity. And Caleb's story spoke to me so much, and its power, that again, I thought, okay, I'm starting to get all these signals from all kinds of different places, including also from my agent who mostly does secular books in New York City. And she's like, I feel like, people in my circles really need this book, in addition to like the Midwestern evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, Christians who I was hearing from. So all those things came together and led to this opportunity to go and do some research and some reporting and tell some stories, which is really the thing I want to do the most.
Yeah. Well, you talk about this radicalization as being sort of a malformation, a wrong discipleship into the way of what you're calling white Jesus. Can you say a little bit about what you mean by white Jesus, and maybe help us understand why that is so appealing to our boys?
Yeah, it's appealing to, I would say, most white American Christians. Like, this is the Jesus in some ways that we grew up with, but also has been shifted in recent years, particularly with online radicalization, and has become more violent, more masculine, in a sense of masculinity, meaning dominance. Uh, and it's really an archetype and an idol in contrast to the Jesus of the Bible. And so I say this again as somebody who grew up in an environment that was very homogenous, very white, very suburban. The churches that I grew up in, the images of Jesus that I saw, Jesus was blonde, he had white skin, he had blue eyes sometimes. He looked very Scandinavian or German. What a shock. Uh, and as I was beginning researching this book about boys and young men, I was surprised by how often I had folks. I remember this time in Arizona on a reporting trip. This person came up to me. He was probably in late 40s, early 50s. Hispanic man said, oh, I was telling him what I was writing about. And he said, oh, are you going to write about white Jesus? And like so many people in and outside the church asked me if I was going to write about white Jesus. And I thought, okay, this is something that needs to be at the center of how we understand this book and how we understand what's happening among American Christians. And so much of it is linked to idolatry. When I first began researching Christian nationalism and this idea of Christianity as divorced from the historic Orthodox gospel. And again, when I say that, this is also a very ancient thing. This is the kind of Christianity, the kind of depiction of Jesus that was lifted up during the Crusades. That's why you're seeing, again, folks like our Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, he has Crusader tattoos.
Right.
So what's being tapped into here is not, I want people to understand that what's being tapped into and being repackaged and sold to boys and young men as a faithful way to encounter the holy through dominance, through violence, through winning, through war. It's being repackaged with new media online, but it's an ancient message. And it's very similar to those of us who have studied the rise of evangelical megachurches, studied the rise of prosperity gospel, is they're repackaging things in a way that looks modern, but the messages that they're selling are ancient. They're fundamentalist, particularly around gender. So it's very confusing for people because the packaging is modern and new and inclusive, but it's really dressing up very ancient ideas that have long sought to overshadow a gospel of Jesus that comes from a very, very different place, and a historical Jesus who looks nothing like this creation of white Jesus that we've made in America.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you naming that. I'm thinking about a little bit, even later today. We're talking to a Black woman who does womanist. She's a womanist theologian, and we're going to talk to her about why it's helpful and productive for Black people to approach the scriptures with their experience as being Black. And I want to maybe poke a little bit about why that's different than white Jesus. And I don't know if you saw this, but I'm kind of taking a risk here. If you saw the recent sort of kerfuffle over a Black comedian using whiteface, Have you heard
I
about
actually
this?
didn't. I didn't. I'm going to
Well,
have to look into this.
yeah. So
Mhm.
Drewski, who's a black comedian, got basically covered his upper body and hands with whiteface, wore overalls, went to a NASCAR race, and was videoed being kind of like a redneck, a whiteface redneck.
Mm-hmm.
And that sparked quite a bit of maybe contentious dialogue over social media, right? Some people saying if blackface is bad, then whiteface should be bad too.
Mm-hmm.
Others saying if whiteface is okay, blackface should be okay too.
Mm-hmm.
And I bring this up because I think it's an illustration of people not understanding something you talk about in your book, which is the difference between white power and non-white power. And I wonder if you and you get at that a little bit with like the Dylan Roof story that you start your book with. Could you unpack a bit how you see this distinction between the way white power functions in our culture and black power does?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this whole discussion that you've just raised is such an illustration of the failure of historical education in this country
Mm.
and this way in which we don't know our own history. We don't know the history of the world. And so to be able to say, well, because this person did this, then blackface is okay, ignores the whole history of the problems with blackface and the
Right.
ways that it led to mockery of Black people, the ways that it led to subjugation of Black people. Uh, you know, American slavery is particularly problematic because it was part of an ideology. It was part of a theology of white supremacy. Um, and so I think that that's, I'm the daughter of a teacher, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think there's been such an attack on public education. There's been an attack on teachers. There's been an attack on books, because when people don't know context and history, it's easy to make arguments like this. So a similar example, maybe, and I mentioned this in Disciples of White Jesus, when I went to visit Mother Emanuel, because I think, there's an analogous argument that people will make when they'll say, well, why can't white megachurches be overtly partisan and political when Black churches have always been
Yeah.
overtly
Mhm.
partisan and
Right.
political?
Right.
Yeah, similar
Um,
question, right? Similar.
Yes. And so I think it has partially to do with finding your own location and what the gospel is calling you into. I was raised very much, again, with this traditional Lutheran sense that the first use of the law is that the gospel calls us into repentance. And sometimes, with a teaching of an atonement theory that's very individualistic, that leads us into a sense that the gospel is meant to forgive our individual sins. That is very much a part of the Bible. It's part of Paul's theology. It's part of some of Jesus' teaching. There is also other functions to the gospel rather than just individual repentance and forgiveness. The
Mhm.
gospel is also a means for reconciliation and a means for liberation. And certainly we see that in Jesus' teachings, in the miracles that Jesus performed. And so one of the changes that I experienced when I went through seminary and studied theology was realizing that the gospel was not always just calling us to condemn ourselves, but sometimes
Mm.
Jesus was coming to set people free.
Mhm.
Um, and I think, you can see some of the strains of that in South American liberation theology. We can see that, where it comes to fore in the Catholic Church and Catholic liberation theology, Vatican II. And so getting back to American ideas about Black power, white power, what's dangerous, what's not, I think that, are we coming from above to push down and using that power to oppress, or are we coming from below and using that power to liberate and to set free? And so much of the advocacy work that has been done by the Black church or by movements for civil rights for non-white people, it's been about liberation. It's not
Yes.
been about superiority or supremacy.
Mm.
And I think white women have a particular responsibility to call these things out, to talk about it, and to witness against it, because we live in both camps.
Yes.
We live in the place where we benefit from white supremacy, and we live in the place where we suffer from white male supremacy. And so I think white women have spent a lot of time being complicit and not enough time, looking to partner with women of color, with men of color, and to seek for our own collective liberation. Because as I say in this book, it's not been great for white men and boys either.
Right.
No.
It's not been good for anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an important aspect of this, right? The difference between, as you're saying, like oppressive power and power to liberate. Because I think that's the fear when people who are sort of within the world of white power, their fear about black power is that, oh, you're just going to flip the tables, and now I'm just going to be under the thumb of somebody else. When it's like, well, actually, like, no, we're trying to contend here for a new imagination for how we can live together. Like, nobody needs to be supreme. Nobody needs to be on top like that. Nobody needs to oppress anybody else for us all to flourish. And man, that is just a huge imaginative leap, I think, for most of us, just because of the world we live in and the propaganda we've been subjected to about all this.
Yeah. Maybe another artifact of this before we move on. I was having a conversation with my son on Saturday night, and we were talking about slurs, and we were talking about, like, he brought up the N word and the F word, which, by the way, the F word has changed now from when I was a kid, right? Which is just interesting. There's a whole podcast on that. We won't go there.
It's now a different word. It's like fudge. Is that what you're saying?
Something like that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So the F slur went from what I grew up as at the F word to a slur for gay people. And so now young people say what I thought, what I refer to as the F word, they say that freely, but the gay slur is now the F word. Anyway, he asks me, Dad, what's the slur for fascists? And I said, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Can you think of one? He goes, well, is it just Nazis? But they gave that to themselves. And I said, well, this is the thing about slurs. If you are in power and using that to oppress people, there typically isn't a slur for you. Slurs are created to demean and degrade and oppress people, dehumanize people. I said, even the slur for white people that black people have used in the past, cracker. I said, does that make you upset when I say that? He's like, no.
Well, and you got to be poor, right? It's
right.
Like specific.
Yeah. You got to be poor. And I just was, and so maybe like white trash or redneck is used by more powerful white people to demean and degrade and dehumanize less powerful white people. But it was sort of this discovery by my 17-year-old of, like, slurs typically travel one direction, from power downward. Yeah. Let's talk about masculinity, because your book does a good job, I think, of helping us understand how gender is performed in a way that's jacked up, right? And you talk about these binaries, maybe is not the right word, but like fear and courage, strength and weakness. Could you say a little bit about how the misconception or malformation performance of masculinity contributes to this white Jesus movement we're seeing today?
Yeah, it makes me really sad, because it's such a shallow performance of strength, and it falls apart really quickly, and it's attractive to lost and lonely and insecure boys and men for the most part. I always talk about how I started out my career as a sports writer, and so I've spent a lot of time around professional athletes, and I come from a sports family. My dad played college football. My husband and I met playing basketball. And so I think it's fair to say I've spent a lot of time around men who fit into sort of that archetype of an alpha male, where they're athletic, they're strong, they're muscular. And what I really find in that is that men who really inhabit that security of strength, many of them do not have this need to lord it over in a way that feels, you know, putting down others. It's a
Mhm.
much more secure form of masculinity. Now, I say that, and I think about, somebody like Harrison Butker, who's an NFL kicker for the Kansas City
Mhm.
Chiefs. And certainly we know that there are athletes who still buy into, certainly many of them. I have a whole chapter on football coaches in my first book, who
Mm.
buy into this movement. Um, but I just continue to want to lift up that I know a lot of strong, powerful white men who do not feel the need to legitimize their strength through
Yeah.
violence and through an idea
Right.
that
Yeah.
they're superior over others.
Yeah.
And to me, when you encounter that genuine masculinity grounded in self-awareness, grounded in kindness, grounded in an ability to have empathy, you can pick out the fake one really, really quick.
Yes.
I mean, I
Yes.
sat in Mark Driscoll's congregation and watched him preach with his big belt buckle.
Mm.
And, that is not a powerful man. It's somebody
Yeah.
who desperately wants to appear powerful.
Yes.
And I think it speaks to the ways in which our society is so hungry for security and so hungry for direction that so many folks will ascribe to that very thin sense of
Yeah.
power.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's. I hear you saying it's. There's a deep irony in this, that the more desperately people try to appear powerful, it reveals the lack of power, actually, the
Yeah.
lack of strength.
Yeah.
And that, but there is such a thing, perhaps as like masculine strength. There is such a thing as it, but it's a parody. What we see, kind of the white Jesus movement pursuing, is a parody of the strength that they're probably really seeking, but
Yeah.
they take this shortcut because it seems maybe easier than developing it in a true way, because that would require vulnerability. That would require repentance.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, I think so much of it is rooted in sacrifice and care for others.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
this narcissism that we're praising at the top of our culture today really precludes any ability to do that.
Yes. Also, in your book, you mention too that this kind of white Jesus movement isn't just a cultural or racial or gendered kind of movement, but it's also a theological one. You mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but I wonder if you could go into detail, or just talk about this a little bit, because you go into detail about it in your book. But like, give us a taste of this. Like, what are some of the warped theological beliefs that feed and sustain this movement, that give it sort of justification, divine justification, so to speak?
Yeah, thanks for asking this, because I think you say the word theology and a lot of people in the media will just go, oh, well, that's religion. Like, we don't need to talk
Yeah.
about that.
Right.
But it's right at the way that people view and understand God is really impactful in the ways that they behave socially, and also the ways that they behave at the ballot box. Their conception of God shapes a lot of our political decision making. So I think it's essential to understand the theological roots of this movement. And I have come to believe that the Lutheran theology that I studied has something to say here. And as someone of German Lutheran background who has studied the ways in which, my distant relations watched the Nazis rise to power and did not say anything and signed oaths of allegiance to Hitler. We all want to lay claim to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but the majority of Christians in Germany were allied with the Nazis. So the theological concept that I think is really important to look at here is the contrast between the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. And you can see both of these within the Bible and within Scripture. But the theology of glory is this idea that the closer that you follow to God, the closer you follow Jesus, the more earthly power, esteem, glory you're going to receive. So you can certainly see the roots of this within the prosperity gospel movement. This idea that, hey, if you give to the church, you follow Jesus, you're going to get a brand new car, you're going to get a brand new house, you're going to be wealthy. And again, we want to make sure we distinguish that from the very real promise of liberation, of prosperity that Jesus wants to make to people who are suffering and in need of help and in need of liberation. But the prosperity gospel twists that and makes it success according to the world's parameters. So the promises of the theology of glory are the same promises that the devil makes to Jesus when Jesus is tempted by the devil. It's a promise of basically gluttony. It's a promise of violence and winning over others. It's a promise of wealth and riches. And this glorification of wealth and riches that American Christians have just embraced and latched onto whole hog is in deep contrast to the ways that Jesus talks about money. We just last Sunday, the gospel lesson talked about Jesus saying, you have to give up your possessions in order to follow me. So the theology of the cross is the alternative story that's been handed down throughout history about what it really means to follow Jesus. And the theology of the cross is this paradox that the closer you follow Jesus, the more you're likely to be rejected, the more you're likely to suffer. We have a history of martyrs within the church, the killing of the prophets. We have Jesus himself, who was crucified by an alliance of religious and political power. And that theology of the cross is one that the American church, specifically the white American church, needs to reclaim and understand as something that we are called into. When I look at my siblings within the mainline church, Episcopalians, Methodists, Presbyterians, we sort of uncritically accepted our role and our seat in places of power in America. And in doing so, we neglected the theology of the cross. And we too uncritically accepted the idea that American Christians were entitled to wealth and power. So it's really an earth-shaking moment where we're called to re-examine our theology and called to re-examine which gospel we're embracing and whose promises we're listening to, because the promises of the theology of glory are not the promises of Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a friend who had just told me that this is several years back, that his high school son was getting into Jordan Peterson. And I was like, well, why? Because I just thought, like, this guy's a intellectual lightweight. And he goes, well, because he feels that being a white man is not okay. And he feels like that the only kind of demographic that is embarrassing and shameful right now is being a white man. And Jordan Peterson tells him that he's actually the victim, that he's actually should be the grieved one. And so Jordan Peterson validates his feelings of perceived feelings of marginalization. Something you talk about in your book, I think, that can help us hold both of these things together, is that you talk about the need for us to validate and deal with both being oppressors and oppressed, that we can learn to talk about these two things at the same time. Can you say more about how that relates to how young white and even older white men are experiencing our country right now?
Yeah, I think part of the place that we're in today is a consequence of progressives or of sort of centrists, Democrats, doing racial justice or sort of identity politics work in a very superficial way. And so we've said that if we can just change labels, if we can just change language, if we can just put a few people of color or women or LGBTQ people in prominent positions of power, we do this in the church, we do this in government, then we are solving the problems of racism and white supremacy. And without making any real structural changes over who holds wealth and power, but we're just sort of moving a few pieces around on the board. then we're going to do this. And I think that that sort of paternalistic thinking and thinking that, well, people are just going to go along with this because we know better for them. People see through that. Young people see through that. Men and boys see through that. And they see, okay, nothing has really changed except for now I'm supposed to be the bad guy. And we've failed to name, I'm speaking in a broad sense. Of course, people have done incredible work in this space. Culturally, people in power have failed to name the real problem in the room, which is America's uncritical embrace of white supremacy. And as soon as that happens, you see all kinds of backlash from major institutions, particularly from national media institutions, from policymakers. And so we're stuck in this space. And I say this again and again with Donald Trump, he has a way of putting his finger on problems that are real when it comes to corruption, when it comes to lying, when it comes to people's feeling of powerlessness and disconnectedness. I think this is why last summer, that presidential debate with Joe Biden was such a watershed moment, because it fed right into that line of they're lying to you. They're lying to you. And it's really, this is why, I try not to use the phrase toxic masculinity. I don't think that I use it in the book, because if we are people who believe that every single human being is created in the image of God, then nobody is toxic. No human being is toxic. And again, people who do believe themselves to be toxic are going to react violently against others and against themselves. Suicide and homicide are different sides of the same coin in many cases. And that's why these movements that are deeply narcissistic tend to also be cannibalistic. We're still waiting for that. It's coming maybe. But so I think that there's hearing again and again that you are not toxic. You were created in the image of God, just as every single person was. Your image is not God's only image, right? God's image is also found in a Black woman. God's image is also found in an Islamic person. God's image is in each and every one of us. But you are not toxic. And we have to expand the identities that are acceptable for white men and boys, just as we've tried to do for women and girls, although that is moving backwards too.
That's really good, Angela. I think I've said in the past that MAGA is about vibes. Which explains why white farmers, for instance, will vote against their own economic self-interest, and now lose farms and have suicide rates off the charts, etc. It's because ultimately Donald Trump channels the white supremacist vibe really well, and so that's what I wanted to announce. And he gives voice to the social and economic anxiety that no other politician will really give voice to. So he
AOC, but
it's not like I mean, what Mom Donnie's doing in New York City right now is sort of shaking the political institutions, because he's actually speaking to those anxieties as well, without the supremacist violence. And people are freaking out. Right? Well, I mean, we could talk about this all day. The book is so important. I do want to just mention that you're not just diagnosing a problem here, but you also are storytelling, and you're storytelling not just stories that illustrate the problem, but you're also storytelling stories that give hope. And the back part of your book, I think you tell various people's stories, just normal everyday people. And you say in your conclusion that only stories can save us. So as we close, would you just pick one of those stories about young white people not opting into this discipleship to white Jesus as a way of bringing hope to what is a very dark situation?
Yeah, well, he would probably say he's not all that young anymore. But the person that I'm thinking of is you'll read about him in the book. He's teaching confirmation classes in his garage in the rural Midwest, and he's somebody who's served in the military, conservative political background, and someone who knows very well suffering, who knows the cost of PTSD and war, has watched his friends and loved ones die in acts of war in the Middle East, and has his own suffering around memories and trauma and torments. And his response to that has been to lean into young people in particular and to spend time teaching about a different kind of Jesus. And so I watched him, I came to their farmhouse. His wife is also a pastor at a different church. And their life's not easy. It's not picture perfect. They're struggling to get by. They're rural pastors in the age of COVID. Every budget session is a challenge. Every day, they've got stuff going on with their own kids. But what I watched this pastor do is he stood there with a chalkboard in a garage with a bunch of kids on folding chairs. And he says, who is Jesus? Tell me who Jesus is, and real basic stuff like, what's his skin color? What language did he speak? Where did he come from? And just teaching the reality of the historical Jesus and the particularity of the historical Jesus, and that particularity is not American. It's not white. It shakes us out of our complacency, and it invites us into a different reality. It decenters ourselves, and I think in a way that is helpful for Americans. And it helps us to see there's a bigger plan here. There's a bigger opportunity for salvation than just your own individual wealth and happiness. And I watched these kids listen and give answers, and it's not all perfect, but they're asking the questions. They're together. And it gave me hope. And it was really, humble. It was not 50,000 baptisms at Saddleback in Orange County, California with Pastor Rick Warren that I went to for Red State Christians. It was just a few kids. And I think there has for too long been a narrative of despair among Christians who are not MAGA, or Christians who didn't follow James Dobson, or Christians who don't worship in arenas. Especially white Christians, right? There's been this narrative of despair that we should be more like that. Why don't we maybe we should try and get the cooler coffee shops, or if we just, do another church-wide study of a purpose-driven life. But I think instead, what I'm hearing from pastors around the country is that, yes, they're struggling. They're being attacked on all sides, especially if they attempt to raise anything about the role of idolatry in American politics, or the role of cruelty and violence. And at the same time, what I'm also hearing from pastors is that they're hearing from community members that the fact that their church exists gives them hope. And maybe these folks aren't going to come to worship on Sunday morning. Maybe they're not going to ever say like, hey, I'm a Lutheran, I'm a Presbyterian, I'm an Episcopalian. Like, who cares? Jesus didn't care about that. But what people are seeing is that there's an alternative that's grounded in hope and love. And I think that when I do these events to speak about these topics, and I look out and I see young dads there with their kids, and they come up to me and they're like, I want to do something different with my kids, with my boys. Or when I see boomer men come up to me and say, I was raised in this way. Like, I was taught empathy is weakness, and I don't believe that. And I want to give a different example. That's where the hope really is these individual different narratives that lead us into a place of love.
Yeah. I think just to speak to that, like I don't go to your church, but your church gives me hope. I think
Yeah.
you probably hear that a lot, Angela. Ben and I hear that frequently. Um, and it's almost like there's more of those people that actually come to our church.
For sure.
And it's
For sure. For sure.
that both encourages me, but also grieves me because I'm noticing that one of the main obstacles that I'm dealing with as a pastor is carving out some kind of imaginative, embodied spiritual space where white Jesus doesn't dominate people's imaginations. We've got a PR problem,
Yeah.
and it goes to the heart and soul of what's wrong with our country. The book again is called Disciples of White Jesus: The Radicalization of American Boyhood. Angela, if people want to connect with you online, I know you have a Substack. Would you share about that and where they can do that?
Yeah, Substack is the best place. Just angeladenker.substack.com. You can subscribe there. You can send me a message, hit reply to any of the notes you get. I do a twice monthly news post. I do a weekly post on Bible and where we're seeing Bible in everyday life. And then I'm on all the other places: Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky. I had to like disable X after the shooting here recently in our neighborhood, but I guess I'm kind of there.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much, Angela, for being our guest today.
Thanks for having me.